So everyone's dissecting around, so I'm going to talk to myself. So the brain we're going to be dissecting is a sheep brain. Ready for it. So among the things worth pointing out immediately would be something called a gyrus and a sulcus. So look at the brain. Gyrus is one of the ridges. This would be a gyrus. A sulcus would be any of the grooves in the middle. So if you run your finger across it, you'll feel a bump. Bump is a gyrus. Groove is a sulcus. So I have to keep looking to see where the camera's pointing at. So gyrus. So let me point some of them out. So if you were to feel from the front to the back, you'll feel like there's a groove that kind of separates the front from the back of the brain, meaning you can separate the front from the back. We call that the central sulcus. We have a big groove that goes from the anterior to the posterior down the middle. That's referred to as the longitudinal fissure. Then in the back, you get a split. It goes from side to side, and we call that the transverse fissure. So we have fissures, it's a really big sulcus, so we have transverse fissure, longitudinal fissure, central sulcus, which is running along here. Okay. So, parts from the outside. This big part here is going to be the cerebrum. Down here we have the cerebellum. Flip it over. We'll have the pons, medulla is underneath it. This portion down here is going to be spinal cord. In here is going to be the midbrain. Over here is the diencephalon, and like I already pointed out, up here is going to be the cerebrum. We have a few other parts we can point out. So cranial nerve number 1, or the olfactory nerve. Right here we have the optic chiasma and the optic nerves, which is cranial nerve number 2. Right there, there's a little bump right here. That would be the start of the hypophysis, which would be the stalk that would end up attaching where the pituitary would be. Pituitary was removed. So when we start to dissect, I want to cut through the longitudinal fissure. Out. So when I do that, it's gentle slicing. There's not really any connective tissue that holds the brain together, so I don't need to try too much. The part that's going to be difficult is going to be the cerebellum. If I just do gentle slicing, yay, split. So we can now start to do some parts. There's light in the room and I don't want to turn off the lights. The kids. There's a groove right here that you can't see, but I can see it. That groove there turns out to be in the middle of the spinal cord. And that is actually one of the aqueducts that lets water flow out. So if I follow that along, what I end up getting are some enlargement areas. So I have an enlargement area right here. That's going to be the fourth. Let's see, can I get it so you can see it? A little bit. Right here, that's going to be the fourth ventricle. We have a third ventricle that if you follow along this groove, kind of surrounds this area right here. This here is actually the thalamus. So it kind of surrounds all the way around it. That area there we call the third ventricle. Coincidentally, if this is the thalamus, if I go below the brain, which is right here, this is the hypothalamus. If you go above it, it's called the epithalamus. You have this stuff right here that's kind of reddish, that's kind of like pushed out. That's the choroid plexus. That's the stuff that turns out to make cerebral spinal fluid, which would be found in the third ventricle, the fourth ventricle, the cerebral aqueduct, and also within the lateral ventricles. So if I keep this flipped this way for you, we happen to have this big clump of white matter right here. That's called the corpus callosum, which connects the two sides of the brain, or the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. And if you notice, it kind of looks like there's something right here, like a divider, and that's called the septum pellucidum. If I look over here, I can see the septum actually a lot easier, which is right here. If I were just to pull it open, what you end up revealing is a cavity inside. The name of that cavity is a lateral ventricle. This turns out to be the right hemisphere of the brain, so this would be the right lateral ventricle. Over here, I would have the left lateral ventricle, but it's covered by the septum, so if I split that open, I can. What I might be able to do is, if I get it right, I can open it up and look inside, and that would be a lateral ventricle. Okay, what other pieces do I need? So, I pointed out the cerebellum to you before. You can see the white matter and the gray matter. No, the gray matter is not gray. There we go, I guess that's the best. So we have white matter in the middle, gray matter on the outside. Gray matter is where you have cell bodies, white matter is where you happen to have the myelinated axons. So this thing here forms like a tree, and it's called the arbor vitae, not necessary for us to know. On the opposite side is something called the pons. The pons is a relay center, so it actually is the part that will that connects the two hemispheres of the cerebellum. Medulla is down at the bottom. Most of the cranial nerves come out of that. It keeps you alive. Midbrain is right here. And there turn out to be some parts in there, but we don't need to know those, at least in terms of their anatomy. Diencephalon is right here, and up here would turn out to be your cerebrum. In terms of bits and pieces to know, the front part of your cerebrum is called the frontal lobe. The part here off to the side, which is actually where your ear would be, this is called the temporal lobe. The top portion here is your parietal lobe. If you find your central sulcus, you have the front portion, which is, oh gosh, why am I drawing a blank? I believe that's the motor cortex, and the central cortex is behind it. If not, I'll fix it with a picture or something like that. This part right here is the occipital lobe, so where you turn out to have vision. I'm double checking everything. I believe I found everything. So, that turns out to be the brain. So again, the parts, we have the medulla, pons, cerebellum, spinal cord, midbrain, diencephalon is here, cerebrum, bump is a gyrus, groove is a sulcus. This is the transverse fissure. I cut down the longitudinal fissure. Here's the central sulcus. I have the fourth ventricle here. There's an aqueduct. Third ventricle. The lateral ventricles are ventricles 1 and 2, and they're on the inside. This section right here, that's all white. We call that corpus callosum. We have frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe. Good luck.